Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient World Magazine podcast. My name is Joshua Brouwers. I'm the editor of Ancient World Magazine. I know it's been a while. It's been nearly a year. What can I say? Loads of stuff has happened. The pandemic, among other things, the difficulty of organizing everyone to get together for a podcast. People had to move houses as well. I even had to move countries. It's been very busy, but from now on we hope to do the podcast more regularly. It won't be another year before the next episode, I promise. Anyway, for today's episode, Dr. Joshua Hall is in conversation with Dr. Ulla Rajala of Stockholm University about early Rome. Enjoy.
So today we're going to be talking about early Rome, early Central Italy, and in particular, two recent books by very well-established scholars that either shed new light or attempt to create new versions of history for this period and region. The first is Nicola Terrenato's wonderful The Early Roman Expansion into Italy, Elite Negotiation and Family Agendas, which came out in 2019, and Gabriele Cifani's The Origins of the Roman Economy from the Iron Age to the Early Republic in a Mediterranean Perspective, which is an even newer book, having just come out in 2021. Both of these kind of continue Cambridge University Press's trend to publish new and exciting scholarship on early Italy. Some of the most influential books on the topic really have, in English that is, have been published by CUP in recent memory, like Christopher Smith's 2006 book on the Gentes, the Roman clans, or Jean McIntosh Turfa's wonderful Defining the Etruscan World, which looked at the brontoscopic calendar as evidence for early Roman and Etruscan history, which I still think is wonderfully controversial, but gave us some new food for thought. So let's talk about these books in sort of separately at first. So just to give listeners a little bit of a rundown, Terrenato's book, The Early Roman Expansion into Italy, looks at how Rome took over the Italian peninsula, but rather than going along with the traditional Roman narratives that it was through war and conquest, and of course, quote, just war, that this happened, Terrenato looks instead to the evidence for elites, both within Rome and elites in communities adjacent to and outside of Rome, and how their interactions and personal agendas worked to create more of a Roman Empire of social networks rather than a Roman Empire of state power through conquest. How did you find this book when you first read it?
Well, it's first of all was that I didn't find it so revolutionizing as he was presenting it himself. And I found the whole idea of the elites taking the Romans onto their side and making profit of it kind of quite promising and kind of giving us new ways to actually discuss the conflict and expansion. But I was a little bit disappointed in the end when he doesn't really expand on the subject matter and was quite a lot of referring to his old works, which I unfortunately hasn't read at that point or haven't had to read at the moment. So I'm kind of more positive than I expected from his own hype, but I was left a little bit disappointed with the actual meat in the book.
I think I can kind of agree in a lot of ways. I remember having a conversation with somebody when I first got my copy of this book that it's all very interesting, but in a lot of ways, it's kind of a repackaging of a lot of his older ideas into a more coherent vision, which I like. And one of the things that it's worth noting, and Terrenato, says this at the beginning, somewhere in the introduction or the acknowledgements, that this book is meant for a wider audience than necessarily early Italian specialists. And I think it does provide a good jumping off point for people who are approaching this maybe from an adjacent subdiscipline. So people who study the growth of elite networks in ancient Greece, for instance. I definitely think it provides a good foundation for people like that, or especially for undergraduates or graduates. But in terms of providing some new stuff for scholars looking to build our own versions of the early expansion of Rome, I agree that I think it could have been a little bit more aggressive in places. So, despite some disappointment that he wasn't more aggressive in some of his discussions, do you think that Terrenato has kind of created a different and more unique approach to looking at the Roman conquest?
I clearly do, because he talks about people, and he talks about other people than the Romans. He goes to the Etruria and takes different elite families and what their destinies were in the new Roman Italy, and he shows that they were quite well off, except for some exceptions like Volsini and Valeri, which are well-known destructions. But it is very individualized and populous past, which is very different from many other descriptions of what was happening during the expansion.
I think that's a good way of describing it, and I think a really important contribution, and perhaps the book's most important contribution, is getting us to think of these complex historical trends like the growth of the Roman Republic through the lens of individuals rather than through, I don't want to say 19th century, but really 19th and 20th century approaches of larger systems theories and state theories and things like that. It's something actually I've been talking about and working on for quite a while, the idea that, the state is inevitably a dead end in terms of historical and archaeological analysis, because the state doesn't exist. And in a smaller scale society like Rome from the Iron Age through to the Middle Republic, it's individual power that makes things kind of turn. And while I don't think we need to completely throw out the idea of community and the influences that can have on these agendas, I definitely think that Terrenato's refocus onto those individuals is very healthy for the discipline. And in some ways, I think the book's greatest value is actually reorienting the study of the period into that lens.
And I think the other very good part is that he's placing so much emphasis on the other regions, not only in Italy, but also in the Mediterranean, when he tries to find out why all these empires started to form at the same time, and why you see similar kinds of developments in different places from Carthage to Tarquinia and Marseille. So it's much more versatile in its scope.
It is, and I will say that's something that I actually appreciate very much as a scholar who has more of a Mediterraneanizing view of central Italy. I very much like that he did this and created this structure that he examined this through, and comparing it to, in the book, the main example that stuck out to me is Syracuse, because thinking about how the Syracusan Empire, if we want to call it that, came to be under like Dionysius I, we actually do see a lot of these similar or almost identical mechanisms that he talks about for early Rome happening in southern Italy and on Sicily. And it's really helpful to see this. And I do think this is a trend in early Roman scholarship, at least, to take a more Mediterraneanizing view. We'll see that in Cifani's book here in a bit, but even in like the recent surveys of early Rome, like Catherine Lomas's wonderful The Rise of Rome and Guy Bradley's survey, they both take more of this globalizing perspective. And it definitely helps keep us grounded that Rome is not some sort of unique, city that was destined to rise. And of it, maybe we can attribute at least some of this to Eckstein's view in Mediterranean anarchy. Maybe it even dates back further than that, but it's a nice trend to see.
I like how he brought up the fact that the Samnites were actually taking the brunt of most of the warfare, so that Rome actually didn't suffer that much. And there were like a couple of hundred of years when people were basically in Samnium fighting there. And it's a miracle that they lasted so long.
His new description of the quote Samnite Wars is great. I really enjoyed reading it because of that, because it's not, these weren't conflicts that the Romans were defending themselves against. These are wars fought in almost entirely in Samnium, and it definitely breaks with the traditional narrative, especially what we see in the literary sources, that these were still defensive, supposedly just wars being fought by Rome.
And it's because I mostly approach Samnium with the view to the material culture and inscriptions and such like. And there you don't see total destruction, but by the 2nd century BC, you have very vibrant Samnium, which is living on its own, how would I say, on its own stride, and seems very prosperous place, which is very much not a country which has been devastated by the war.
I think, that is one thing that comes out in Terrenato's book that's really important to keep in mind when we talk about this so-called conquest, is that really throughout Italy, with some exceptions, like those that you noted earlier, the areas that Rome supposedly devastated and conquered, we don't have that much reason in the archaeological evidence to think that really happened, because suddenly, within supposedly 5 to 10 years of Rome coming in and destroying everything, we have evidence for a vibrant, flourishing civilization. And that is one thing that Terrenato picks up on and emphasizes throughout the book, and something that I think really does point to more than just this destructive warfare being at work in these situations. I just as an aside, talking about Samnium, I had the absolute pleasure of reviewing Scopacazza's book on Samnium for JRS a few years ago, and it was eye-opening to me, because my interest really kind of falls off towards the middle of the 4th century, and I haven't really done that much work with Samnium up until then. But reading the first large modern English language survey of Samnium was very eye-opening in terms of just how vibrant it was. And in the wake of the wars, like you said, or supposed wars, like you said, it wasn't just a wasteland like you would expect.
No, definitely wasn't a wasteland. And anyway, it's quite interesting, because I was previously not very interested in Hellenistic period, because the material culture looks very same in different areas. And more I have recently looked into it, the more vibrant and interesting it looks like, and kind of helps to counteract this idea of Great Rome.
Yeah, that's from a ground up perspective, that's something that's always struck me about so-called Roman Italy, especially in the BCE era, the first millennium BCE, is that yes, Rome appears to have held some sort of political hegemony, or the elites in Rome, but really the peninsula was not some sort of unified monocultural place. It was still a very diverse area all the way through. I mean, honestly, throughout the ancient period, if you look at the evidence, for instance, from Sicily after Rome very securely took power there in the wake of the First Punic War, Sicily was still very Greek, very indigenous, and not very Roman for a long time.
Yes. When we look at Etruria during the Hellenistic period, it was very Greek, in a sense that the tomb architecture I have been specializing lately, it's very inspired by the Greek form models, but it's not a copy. It's all appropriated to the local pastes and local uses and local materials. And it's absolutely fascinating And it's also quite fascinating how it all comes to an end, apparently because of the social war.
That's one aspect of Etruscan history that I'm not as versed in as I should be, but it is remarkable to see just the end, essentially, of a unique Etruscan civilization at that point, which is very sad. But I think it does, actually, that break really does say something about this period of Roman expansion, the period that Terrenato was looking at, which is primarily the Hellenistic, that it wasn't what we would necessarily think of as conquest. You know, when we think of conquest, especially with modern anti-colonial or decolonial narratives, we think of places like North America, where European civilization, as some sort of broad amorphous thing, conquered and essentially destroyed indigenous culture in the areas of the United States and Canada, whereas the Romans in this era weren't doing that. They weren't wiping cultures out. They weren't really even wiping cities out, except, you know, in a few instances. But even those, if, you know, looking at Veii, for instance, you know, we're still very unclear as to what really happened in at the beginning of the 4th century there. You know, did Rome really destroy the city? Was it more of a casual eviction of certain groups that weren't allied or friendly to the Romans?
Well, we will see when the Bartolonis and Carandini's excavations in the area of the city come out.
It will be nice. I reviewed the University of Texas Veii volume a while ago, and it's great to see some newer data for the city. But Veii is definitely one of those places that you just wish we could have unlimited access to the earth underneath it.
Yes, and it's one of the problems with Veii is very much that different research groups have different agenda. It's the Bartolonis group. They are interested in the proto-city and archaic city, so they couldn't be less interested in Hellenistic in kind of the 4th century or 3rd century. And then you have the Carandini's excavation group, who are again interested more on the Roman side. So there is a gap between different disciplines.
That's a really good point, and something that some of our listeners may not be as familiar with, that archaeology isn't just a single field, and individual archaeologists and their research teams have things that they're looking for when they excavate, not like specific pieces of or specific artifacts or anything, but specific eras for their data sets and things, and that influences where you dig, what you dig, how you dig. Worth keeping in mind, because our readership and our listeners are a healthy mix of lay people and scholars, and I know that there is still a very powerful trend to view archaeology in some sort of Indiana Jones style narrative in the popular sphere, which is certainly not how it works in reality.
Yes, and of course, when I talk about Italian archaeology, one has to remember that there at the university you have separate departments for prehistoric archaeology, Etruscology, and then Roman archaeology. And this affects how different periods are studied, so that prehistorians mostly deal with the period before the 600 BC. And then you have Etruscology, who do a little bit earlier periods, but then mainly discuss this. And then you have Roman archaeologists, who are mainly interested in from perhaps 300 forward.
It's an interesting system of academic boundaries that shows up in the scholarship. You can actually detect it. I remember when I first started studying early Italy, one of the things that really caught me off guard was how little modern anthropological archaeological theory was used by Etruscologists and Roman archaeologists in Italy, whereas many prehistorians in Italy actually engaged in this, and it leads to the creation of almost two completely different narratives.
That's so very true, but it's also down to the tradition in Italian university world that professors have introduced different types of research to their students and encouraged them to do different things, so that many Roman professors and Etruscologists, they have spent their time doing art historical research instead of being interested in anthropology or theoretical archaeology.
You do see that dichotomy still in the American Academy a little bit. A lot of people who focus on Etruria and especially Republican Roman archaeology departments come from an art history background, which isn't bad. I mean, there's a lot to be gained there, obviously, but myself coming from more of the social theory background, I like seeing a little bit more engagement because, no matter what you're discussing or how you're discussing it, you're relying on assumptions. And, many of these were founded in an era of scholarship when sociology was as associated with social Darwinism as it was with anything else. So it's always nice to have people trying to break that. That's one of the reasons I liked Nick Terrenato and I can't remember his first name, Haggis's volume from, I think, about 2011 that set out to question the neo-evolutionary paradigm of states and state formation in the Greek and Roman world. It was nice to see something like that coming out because, again, a lot of our background assumptions when we approach these questions are kind of rooted in this Weberian and adjacent world of social theory, which is kind of a good segue between the work of Nick Terrenato that takes more of an individualist human approach to analyzing early Italy, to Gabriele Cifani's The Origins of the Roman Economy from the Iron Age to the Early Republic in a Mediterranean Perspective, which, not to do it a disservice, but I think justifiably can be described as relying on these older paradigms to form the bulk of the discussion, which caught me off guard, I'll admit. So what was your initial reaction to Cifani's book?
It's difficult to say now when I'm online. It's kind of the whole subject matter of the book in the end. How would I say? It's less about Roman economy and it's more about the settlement centrally and Rome's place in the world. And I just have to disagree with Gabriele with some of his very profound assumptions he takes in this book. And I'm really in awe when I'm reading it and kind of to the detail he has traced to the most recent finds in Central and how he presents all the material which has been found from diverse places. But then he uses it all in a way to create this construction of his own and basically takes as a basic principle that everything which is nearer than 200 kilometers from Rome is basically local to Rome. And, well, he doesn't say it, but it seems to be Rome. And that's basically the story of the book.
That description is very apt because, we were just talking about how it's a strength of Terrenato's book and other recent books on this period that they take this more globalizing approach, but they do it in a way that I think is very well signposted in terms of their analysis. So when Terrenato is talking about something from one of the neighboring Etruscan cities or a settlement somewhere in Latium, he's making it very clear that this is evidence for that settlement, whereas, as you just described, Cifani kind of takes it all as evidence for Rome, which is poses an interesting methodological problem in terms of how far we want to try to extrapolate some of this evidence. Looking at like earlier discussions of Etruscan society, for example, in a lot of like the broader surveys and things, we see scholars do this. So you'll have evidence for some like the Orientalizing period or something, predominantly coming from, say, Tarquinia in one of the syntheses, and that's taken broadly to be Etruscan society in general. And it feels like Cifani has kind of done this for just the city of Rome.
I find this book very complex, and I find the way he presents some of the data misleading, because, for example, all the distribution maps, they are for Latium only, and they exclude Etruria, although Etruria is a lot, and different find spots and towns there are discussed. But you have no idea how much of this same material he discusses for Rome, which is kind of presented as a sign of Roman dominance. How much you have Etruria in Tarquinia, in Caere, in Fulch, so in Veii. So it leaves big question mark in the mind of researcher of the same area.
I do wonder what this book would have looked like and what his description of Rome would have looked like if he had been a little bit more upfront comparing the data to the larger Etruscan settlement with Rome, because he definitely uses what data he does to try to create a picture of a Roman economic powerhouse dating pretty much all the way back to the Iron Age, or to the early Iron Age almost, or not almost. I guess he does stretch it all the way back to the early Iron Age.
He suggests that Rome had the dominance of the salt beds in the river mouth of the Tiber already during at the beginning of the Iron Age, or even the late Bronze Age.
I don't remember which he argues for, but it seemed extremely early. Even if we follow the supposed literary evidence, I think it predates what we have in there, which was surprising. Looking at it, I think it might be the final Bronze Age or the late Bronze Age that he dates it to, which is an interesting one.
He kind of totally sidelines Veii and Ficana in these discussions, and basically Ficana is non-existent as a place.
It disappears in his narrative. I actually think a lot of places kind of disappear in his narrative, but Ficana certainly.
Don't start with Crustumerium. Don't start with Crustumerium.
I think everyone involved in that project would be surprised to find that Crustumerium is not necessarily spoken of very positively.
Well, it's spoken positively, but it's not spoken as an independent town state. It's spoken as an outpost for Rome, which comes as a surprise.
And from almost the very beginning as well, if I remember right. That wasn't something that I had on my mind to talk about, but I think almost from the beginning of the book, he essentially implies or outright says that, which is very confusing. But I think it really shows either his agenda or just his thinking on this, that for Cifani, unlike Terrenato, this is a period in which Rome was a state in a very traditional sense. He uses terminology throughout the book along the lines of the public authority. What exactly that is meant to be, I think, goes unanswered. But it's shocking when you compare these two works that are both produced by leading scholars in the field 2 years apart from one another, that essentially present two very different versions of Rome from the early Iron Age through to the mid-Republic. That on the one hand, you have Terrenato looking at it through the lens of individuals, elite networks of elite power and things like that, and showing how diffuse power structures in Rome really were. And then Cifani, on the other hand, who almost takes for granted that there was some sort of central authority in a very modern sense, making conscious decisions. We see that in the discussion of the supposed weights and measures that I think are dated to glacial 4A or something like that. in the book, and a handful of other things, including regulation of trade, for which we don't really have evidence.
Well, that's partly why I'm disappointed with this book, is that Cifani has, in his previous books, he has pretty much stayed within the limits of the data. And he has, in private discussion, emphasized the importance of the data in drawing conclusions and presenting something which doesn't have data as something which is unwished for in research and scholarship. So suddenly seeing him not actually agreeing his own principle, really disappointing.
I can see that in the bulk of what I've engaged with Cifani's scholarship for has been fortifications and they thinking about the ability to mobilize labor power and things like that in early central Italy. And I still remember some of his discussions from the last decade, which argued that we can't discount a full Roman fortification wall because of the absence of evidence. We need to look at what we actually have and base our discussions on that. And that is very different, as you say, from the methodology he has used in this particular book. But I wonder if part of that is almost a reaction to the wider globalization or Mediterraneanization views that people are taking. Because, we have some evidence that there are, I don't like states. I think that it's a kind of an analytical dead end for ancient world studies, but we do see things like states, for instance, in the Eastern Mediterranean. And, one of the things that he does very well in this book is show that there were ties to the rest of the Mediterranean with Rome, even if some of that evidence is taken from outside of Rome itself to show that. But I wonder how much of some of his perspectives might be because of this and might be sort of a reaction to the implications of, Rome participating in this wider, not to use terrible terminology, but quote, more developed Mediterranean world.
I don't know how much of it, also a response to the fact that so many researchers have been emphasizing the other cultures in central Italy as well. And it's like some researchers like me seeing Rome as one village like the others and not being especially particular until the Orientalizing. So, and after that, it's like, it was quite interesting when I was reading Cifani's book, was like we had totally different story until about 600. And then we started to sing from the same songbook. And also, but the problem with his story was that because he had already expanded Rome extensively before 600, so he didn't have room for Ficana or Crusumerium or other places in central Italy. And he doesn't discuss the disappearance of those places around 500 BC or quite soon afterward, and what that might mean to the economy of the place. So it's kind of, our stories got to the same trail, but they still were not similar because we were not talking about the thing.
It's scary though how much influence, not talking about those particular same things can have on the creation of the narrative, because as you say, he's essentially erased multiple settlements from the economic history of central Italy at this point, which is a problem because both Ficana and Crustumerium were very dynamic, developed, interesting settlement with a long and rich archaeological history that I think it's unfair to completely erase, but also it has implications for Rome that they did exist and then that they disappeared, as you say, around 500, and not accounting for that is a problem. Even if this is meant to be an economic history, not a more traditional political history, it definitely creates problems. And I think a good example of how you don't have to do that, but still look at Rome as a relatively well-developed settlement fairly early, is in Francesca Fulminante's Urbanization Work.
Yes, that's a very good book. But it's like, I must say now, before we start talking about that because she was basing her economic calculations on my PhD. So I'm looking to her work very favorably from that personal point of view, that she actually took my minimalistic economic models for face value and then used them for Rome and could show that they actually worked.
There's nothing wrong with favoring arguments that use your data and your ideas. I think that's a very natural natural consequence of scholarship and of other scholars that use your work. Do you think it's fair to say that Cifani's book and Fulminante's books in some ways present two different Romes?
Agree. It's because when you read Cifani's book, he actually uses the subject matter from Francesca's book in his text, but he's very coy in a way he refers to people, because to the listeners, this book has endnotes, which is very tedious to follow when you are reading the book. And then you kind of have a number and you have to start flipping through the end page. And all the different chapters, they have the end note numbers starting from 1. So you really have to go through in order to find the real references. And he's very sparing in mentioning people's names in the text. So actually quite a lot what he says is based on Francesca. So economically, they are on the same page, even if the kind of the state of affairs and the city.
That's fair. I'll admit it's been quite a while since I've read Fulminante's book. I'm finishing up my own book on early Rome right now, though, so I will be revisiting it very soon in revising one of my chapters. Is there anything else that you think would be worth talking about in terms of Cifani's book?
Well, it's like I want to take some good parts.
Yeah. Okay. We've talked about some negative aspects of Cifani's book, but ultimately it is a valuable contribution. There's absolutely no doubt about that. It is a good book in many ways.
Yes, and it's absolutely fantastic as a handbook. When you want to read something about the latest find and what kind of economic evidence you have for Central Italy, it's absolutely up to date and fantastic. And the other thing I want to emphasize is that it actually discusses the treaties with Carthage, with San Panacea. So there are very good points to take up from this. And the pictures are nice.
It is fairly well illustrated with maps, which is very helpful. And in some ways, like Terrenato's book, I think that this will be a very good thing for instructors to be able to assign to students. Obviously, with some caveats, depending on your perspective on the narrative presentation of Rome, there's no doubt that this is the single best, especially English language catalog now for early Rome. Whether you're looking at it from an economic perspective or really any other historical lens.
And it's worth the money only for the appendixes in the end.
Yeah, the appendices are massive. So to give readers an idea, the book itself is 400 and some pages in total. The discussion stretches through to page 235, and from 237 onwards is appendix, bibliography, and index, and the index is fairly short. So a lot of this, there are essentially 200 pages of indices that are, or maybe about 100 pages of indices that are extremely important because they have everything from chronologies through to remains, locations of remains, frequencies of remains, along with bibliographies. One of the nice things about his tables, looking, for instance, at table 9, the Latin onomastic outside Latium, all of the finds that he notes, he also includes the bibliography to go along with them in the table itself, which is a wonderful research tool. It'd be nice, honestly, if there was a digital companion to this with searchable versions of a lot of these things.
Yes, I don't know if they have produced the electro book yet. So
I think they have. I'm sure they have, because CUP has been pretty good about producing ebooks right alongside the print books. So that is something for any instructors out there who listen to this podcast. If you're teaching a course on early Rome, or even just a Republican history class, and want to assign some very good, in some places quite dense, discussion of material remains from early Rome and its environs, definitely not restricted to early Rome, Cifani's book is great for that. I was just looking really quick at how he does discuss the treatise with Carthage, because I could not remember how exactly he approached these. I think it's a fairly conservative, but also, I don't know, helpful approach. Definitely not one that I would say is out of the ordinary necessarily, although a recent book did try to dismiss the supposed 509 treaty. I have it around here somewhere. I can't remember the argument exactly, because it wasn't convincing to me, but I unfortunately think that treaty is probably somewhat genuine, not entirely, but
I mainly kind of was interested in the discussion from the sense that it expanded the discussion, because on the title, Cifani promises to place Rome in Mediterranean perspective. And I read these two books in the order that I read Cifani first and Terrenato then. And in the end, I was surprised how limited the Mediterranean aspect was Cifani's book.
He picks up throughout that things are being traded with the wider Mediterranean, but there isn't much of a contextualization, which is odd, because it somewhat bucks the trend that we mentioned earlier of this wider perspective. And to its detriment, because I think one thing students especially would get out of this, or a way to make this book even more valuable to students, would be to have provided a more robust discussion of the Mediterranean economic system in general, because that itself is something that's undergone considerable scholarly revision in the last 2 decades, 3 decades. And it would have been nice to see more about that, and how Rome and Central Italy more generally fit into it.
Yeah, I think it's in similar way, this book is about Roman economy, or not about economy, as Francesca Fulminante's earlier Italian book on the tombe principesche wasn't actually about tombe principesche, but tombs in general.
That's a good comparison. So with these two books in hand, there have been a lot of very large studies on Central Italy published in even just the last few years. This seems to be kind of a boom time for our area of expertise. Do you think these two books in particular will have an influence on how we view and talk about and narrate the archaeology and history of Rome from, say, the early Iron Age through to the Mid-Republic?
Well, it totally depends. It's how much the academic community actually discusses the problems in Cifani's book and takes up the good parts of it, which is material, in a kind of similar way as Kierstad's Rome had a problematic underlying agenda, but it was extremely important as a source material. So I think this Cifani's book definitely has some time ahead of it, as an undergraduate reader on Roman finds in central Italy.
I totally agree with that. And actually, you just you mentioning right there, its life as an undergraduate reader. I doubt CUP will hear this podcast, but if they do, one thing that would be really nice is an affordable paperback version of this book because of its nature as providing some interesting discussion, of course, but its use as a massive catalog would be helpful if students had access to a low-cost version. Obviously, an ebook through your institution is helpful, but if students are like me with extremely poor eyesight, having a physical copy is much easier to work through and really to develop an understanding of the material from. What about Terrenato's book? This is the
I
one
think
that
it will leave as a history book. It's fun, although it goes through material, it's a history book more than archaeological book. So I think it has definitely value as such, but as an archaeology book, I'm not so sure. But it's like, as he said himself, he wanted to create something which was unpretentious and approachable for everybody and tells a story to laypersons. So it definitely delivers on that front. So it has some shelf life, but I'm not totally sure how well it will last as a scholarly opus.
I have similar thoughts. I will say the book that I'm currently working on actually talks about quite a few of these ideas in a more compact fashion because I'm mostly interested in early Iron Age through to really the end of the 5th century and looking at these networks of power and how we can detect them in the material remains. But I do think that this book is very reflective of Terrenato's place, kind of unique place between history and archaeology, because obviously he's very well known for his excavations and is a consummate archaeological researcher, but he also, a lot of his work that really has culminated in this book has been more historical and narrative in nature, certainly. But I do think that between the two of them, Terrenato's ideas might have a little bit more lasting power, simply because if people pick up on it and run with, this concept of trying to look more towards the individual and looking more at individual and small group agency, it really does provide us a new way of looking at the Italian peninsula in general and prehistory and proto-history quite broadly.
And it explains quite nicely and neatly how the local aristocracies stayed in power throughout the transitional period. So it's quite nice as an explanation, whereas I have so many doubts of Gabriele's explanation of Great Rome, which came from the beginning and went to the end.
I mean, I'll play devil's advocate and defend him in some ways, because I think that perspective it's definitely grounded in one approach to Rome that has fallen out of favor in general, but I don't want to say isn't entirely unlegitimate or illegitimate, because I don't believe in it myself. But I mean, there is a lot of background as to why he approaches it from trying to see the grand Rome narrative. And I think in some ways it might be grounded in Italian scholarship, in the world of the Italian Academy, looking for the grand Rome and the early glories of Italy's past I don't want to say that it's extremely prominent, but you see it popping up in scholarship throughout.
Well, it's what I discuss with and what I disagree with many of my Italian colleagues is the size of the Etruscan and Latin centers during the Iron Age. And my Italian colleagues, they want to see them being populating all the plateaus of these big future towns already during the Iron Age, and kind of having thousands, if not tens of thousands of inhabitants at that phase. So you can set Cifani's book into that narrative very well. So he just tries to go one step further, because Rome has to be the number one.
Yeah, it can no longer be the little village by the Tiber that suddenly became a very important center. And I do think that that's kind of funny, because in at least some scholarship, we had this trend for a long time of describing Rome as just either a small village on the Tiber or at a ford in the Tiber, or maybe a series of small villages at this ford, to in the early Iron Age, to now being a full-fledged city in that period in Cifani's view, which it's a good example of how scholarship can seem so drastically different from one another, or how ideas can seem so drastically different within the same discipline, using essentially the same evidence, but based on your perspective.
Down to your interpretation of the material and your starting assumptions.
Oh yes, that for all, especially graduate school listeners of this podcast, make sure that you very well explain your foundations and the theoretical basis of your work. Otherwise, you may run into the trap of being talked about by colleagues online at some time in the future. Is there anything you'd like to bring up or talk about before we part ways?
Well, it was just before we met today, I was flipping through my electronic copy of Isaiev's book on similar material in central Italy and Italy, and was looking at the place she called Rome, and that was partly different from the place both Terrenato and Cifani had. So kind of trying to find out this emotional response to Rome in the past, kind of bringing in the a more female touch to the research, looking at the migrations and identities.
I still don't have my copy of Isaiev's new book, but I definitely want it for that reason, because it's worth noting that both Nicola Terrenato and Gabriele Cifani are very much white male scholars, and the perspectives, even though I like to describe Terrenato's as being considerably different, it is still grounded in really traditional questions and traditional ways of looking at them. It's not looking at more modern post-colonial perspectives on these topics, because you still see a lot of national ethnonyms, but you still see a lot of that kind of perspective in Terrenato's work, whereas I know in more deconstructive narratives you're starting to see something completely different, and maybe we'll see a much different version of Terrenato come out in the next few decades, written by a female scholar with much different perspectives.
And it's like Isaiev's work is also interesting because she takes Corfinium in Samnium and juxtapositions it with Rome, and how they had totally different models of governing, and how these two places came together and fought each other in social war. So that's also a very interesting point to take when one looks at Samnium and Rome from Terrenato's point of view.
That's interesting. I need to try to secure a copy of Isaiev's book, but that kind of reminded me, that comment. I don't know if it's on your radar, but the late David Graeber and David Vengrove, I don't know how his surname is pronounced, at UCL. They're forthcoming The Dawn of Everything.
It has come out in UK.
Oh, it's out. I have to wait until November 9th for my pre-ordered copy.
Yes, it's out, and it was selected as The Guardian's Book of the Week.
I heard that it was the number 3 book in the US, even as a pre-order. So your comment about how the difference in governance at Rome and in Samnium, they ended up at war with each other. One of the things that I've gleaned from the early reviews of that book, of The Dawn of Everything, is that they push the idea that we need to be looking at individual societies on their own terms, and
they basically deny the existence of evolution, the social evolution.
I like that. That's to an extent something that I have discussed in places. I don't know if I want to throw the entire concept out. I think it's healthy to throw a lot of it out, though. But I wonder how much that is going to influence some of our perspectives on this.
I haven't read the book yet. I have to get a copy of it. I know that Christopher Smith has written his blog on that book this week.
I read that. I read that last night, and it's interesting. Some of the things that he noted are possible problems are things that I kind of expected from a book by Graeber, who I very much respect. I don't mean to throw any kind of shade onto him. David Graeber was a very brilliant man, and even though I have problems with debt, I still think it was a wonderful contribution. But I'll link Christopher Smith's discussion of that book to this podcast. Obviously, the book will be out in the US by the time this gets published, but for our readers, a Romano-centric review, short review of The Dawn of Everything might be helpful. Anyway, thank you so much.
And this is a good point to stop. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it. Many thanks, of course, to Dr. Ulla Rajala for joining us on this podcast. If you like what we do and want to support us, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/ancientworldmag. Among our patrons, we would like to thank Tony Santangelo, Scott K., Rachel Macmillan Pratt, Rachel K. Bicknell, Joshua A., Graham O'May, Chaos Magic, Carolyn Dolgenos, Andrew Hughes, Rachel Harris, and last but not least, Brent Wackholder. And remember that there's lots more to discover on our website at ancientworldmagazine.com. Once again, I hope you've enjoyed listening. See you next time. Bye-bye.